So hi everyone, and thanks for joining me today. I'm Paula Delaney and I'm a design manager here at Ambition Institute. So I design curriculum content for the Early Career Teachers programme that we are currently running a pilot programme in. I was a teacher for 14 years, as well as a head of department, faculty and a member of the strategic leadership team. I'm also school governor and national leader for Women Ed England. For those of you that haven't heard of us, Ambition Institute is an education charity with a mission to help teachers keep getting better, particularly those who are working in the most disadvantaged communities. So we run professional development from every stage of teachers' careers, from new teachers where I work all the way up to multi-academy trust CEOs. But today's session forms part of our summer series. So this is a programme of webinars that we've been running through the summer term to support you through and beyond the coronavirus pandemic. And this is in fact the final session of the summer series. Hopefully you'll agree we've saved the best to last. But today we're going to be looking at memory and the role of forgetting in learning. And this is of course particularly relevant now as we begin to welcome back more pupils into school who will have remembered a varying amount of what you taught them before and during the lockdown. If you have any questions throughout the course of the session, please pop them in the Q&A box during the session and we'll try and answer as many of them as we have time for at the end. So I'm really pleased to be joined by two expert school leaders today, Moran and Rachel Speed, and I'm going to hand you over to Rachel first so she can introduce herself.
Hi everyone, nice to be on here this afternoon, and I hope I can share some of my experiences and some of the work that we're doing to support a very relevant topic at the moment, but also some ideas that will help to continue this area as we move forward. I'm fortunate enough to have moved into a new role quite recently, and I now support a number of schools in the Federation with particular focus on the quality of education.
Over to you, Carly.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Moran. I'm Deputy Head Teacher at Westminster City School. Really fantastic to be in your company. Like Rachel and Paula, really exciting topic, really relevant topic. And my aims today are to share with you some of the work we did before COVID on how we tried to overcome learning loss, what we've done during COVID and what we plan to do going forward when pupils return to school.
So I think it's useful to always start from how we kind of frame this session and start with common understanding of what do we actually mean by learning loss. And there are many different terms and definitions we could use, but we'll start by taking a moment to have a read of this definition. So when we're talking about learning loss, or it's a loss of or deterioration in the knowledge and skills as a result of gaps in learning. So which we are currently facing, but there are many other causes that can happen throughout a pupil's academic career. So if we think about some of the reasons why pupils might experience learning loss, first of all, considering school absences. So in this instance, it's the individual pupil that due to, it could be prolonged illness, it could be a family decision to remove them from education, that has meant they are no longer in a school situation and there's a gap in their learning. But we also need to include here pupils who've been excluded, whether that is temporary or permanent, as that can also lead to gaps in their learning if there is not a suitable alternative provision available to them. Other pupils may experience significant interruptions in their formal education. For example, if we have recently immigrated refugee pupils come into our school community, they may have been unable to attend school in their home country due to societal unrest. And then we might consider some factors which impact a larger number of pupils. So something along the lines of lower quality teaching can lead to slower progress and learning loss with regards to age-related expectation. So some meta-analysis of research, such as those done by Hattie, have found that highly effective teachers can teach pupils up to a year and a half or more of content in a single year. On the flip side of that, other teachers who might be less effective could teach only a half a year of content in that year. So if pupils receive poor quality teaching over multiple years, the learning loss then becomes compounded, and that is decreasing the pupils' chances of ever catching up to their peers. Probably the form of learning loss that we're most familiar with is summer learning loss. And this occurs when pupils have an extended break in their education during the summer during the summer holidays, usually about 6 weeks in the UK, and this kind of leads to a universal learning loss among pupils. Now, some schools may adopt strategies that they intend to kind of mitigate that learning loss. So they may set tasks or independent work, might set reading activities. In the past, we have had intervention in summer schools to try and overcome that learning loss. But a lot of the time what will happen is, once we return to the classrooms, the educators will try and actively review that prior learning to try and bring it back into memory and fill any gaps that pupils have. But today we're thinking about the learning loss that may have occurred as a result of the partial school closure due to this global pandemic that we're finding ourselves in. And we want to think about how we can try and tackle that. But before we try and tackle it, we need to delve a little bit deeper into understanding how pupils actually learn and understanding why learning loss might occur. So let's start this by considering Willingham's simple model of memory. So I always think this is quite a useful model to start with, because what Willingham did quite well was summarise decades of research in cognitive science into quite a simplified format. So it's a good starting point. If we think about memory as being divided into two parts, we have working memory and we have long-term memory. So working memory is where the act of thinking, that conscious and effortful act of thinking, actually takes place. So, for example, you're trying to do a calculation in your head. Thinking takes place when information from your environment is combined with information from your long-term memory. So you're remembering something that's relevant in your prior knowledge, and it's combined within working memory. So one thing to bear in mind about working memory is that it actually has a limited capacity. So our working memory can hold a limited number of chunks of knowledge over a short period of time. So about 15 to 30 seconds, you can hold, depending, 3 to 5 chunks of knowledge. If there's too much information, you can have cognitive overload occurs. For example, we've probably all been in a situation, and I know in my early career I give a student a list of 8 different things I want them to do. 2 minutes later, I come back to them and they've remembered one, because cognitive overload, they just can't remember that many things at once. And the amount that working memory can hold differs depending on for different people. And there's many factors that will influence that. Complexity of what you're actually asking somebody to do, or if they have relevant prior knowledge about the topic or the activity. So long-term memory is where knowledge that we have acquired through thinking is stored. Sorry about that. Is stored as schema or mental models. And this is the prior knowledge that can help us process new learning and new knowledge. So, for example, walking down the road, we see a car that's coming towards us. Long-term memory, the knowledge exists in the long-term memory that actually cars are quite dangerous. And the combination of the piece of information from our environment and from our long-term memory, put them together in a working memory, and we think, oh, I need to be careful here. I need to take a step back, stay on the footpath. But when we don't have to think hard enough, or we don't practice retrieving information from our long-term memory over time, we may struggle to recall that information, or it may become incomplete. So we start forgetting things. If we practice retrieving, and if we practice using that knowledge, we can develop both the storage strength, so how accurately we can recall that information, and the retrieval strength, so how much effort and prompting we require to actually recall it. So when we understand how pupils learn, it can help us to identify actually when learning may have taken place and the difference between learning and performance. So if we think about learning, is that relatively permanent change in behaviour and knowledge that's stored in the long-term memory. Whereas performance is just the immediate behaviour or knowledge that can be observed and measured. And this involves information that's held in working memory, but not necessarily held in our long-term memory. So we can actually have a performance where something's held in our working memory and then it's forgotten. And it is never actually stored and processed in our long-term memory. But like I said, because learning happens inside a pupil's mind, we can't measure it directly. So we have to make inferences about pupils' learning based on their performances in assessment. So what we see them put down in paper, or the behaviours they exhibit when asked a question or asked to replicate an activity or process. And that's why it's important that we actually embed those assessment opportunities into learning, so that we can begin to make those inferences and help us avoid that pitfall of, I taught it, they learned it. And just because we taught something, we need to really think about, did they really? And how do we know they've actually learned it? Because like I've said, if something's not actually learned and stored in the long-term memory, it can't be retrieved later. And when we set those end of lesson assessments, if pupils are not successful, then we need to respond in some way. That could be providing feedback that closes the learning loop. It could be reteaching part or all of the content. And sometimes we just have to realise it's perfectly acceptable to have to reteach something. It's better that we respond, fill in those gaps of learning and any misconceptions, and then check that understanding again, then keep moving on and assuming that the learning has happened. Main advice would be move on only when we're sure, as far as possible, that performance in the assessment indicates learning. Though we should plan to revisit and check again, because we should be clear that performance and learning are not mutually exclusive. So if we think about it, even if a pupil performs well in an end of lesson assessment, it could be that it was held in their working memory. It's not necessarily an indicator that content has been learned and stored in long-term memory and can be recalled later. So if we want to make sure we have that deep and durable learning that's going to withstand time, we should plan to revisit the content in future lessons and ensure that it is stored in pupils' long-term memory and can be retrieved for use in other contexts. So as I've mentioned, everything we learn and commit to memory has that storage and retrieval strength. So how well consolidated is it, and how easily or readily can we actually retrieve it when we need it? So if something has a low storage strength and a low retrieval strength, then it's really difficult to retrieve it later, and it's really difficult to relearn it. And it's probably because the learning wasn't solid in the first place. So it could be I'm out and about, somebody tells me their address, I don't really pay much attention, haven't really taken it in, low storage strength, and I can't really retrieve it or remember it later. Or if we have something may have a high storage strength, but a low retrieval strength. So something knowledge or information we've not used for a long time. Example here, it's a dress I lived at as a child. Recently, for some weird reason, I was looking back over Romeo and Juliet, and I had a great English teacher who made us learn off quotes, and I was trying to think of it, and then I read a bit of a section from the play, and straight away I started reaming off these quotes because it was just very easily relearnt. It's hard to retrieve initially, but once I started, I could easily retrieve it. Something with a higher retrieval strength but low storage strength is something that is probably easily retrieved, that I'm using it at the moment and I need it right now, but I haven't put the effort into really learning it. It's hard for me to retain it, and I probably won't be able to retrieve it down the line. I won't be able to retain that information. But where we're actually aiming for our pupils to be is in this last quadrant, that they can easily retrieve knowledge and that is easily retained. So my current address, you would hope that I know it quite well, I can find my way here, and as long as I'm living here and I keep coming back to it, it's going to be something that's easy to remember. And that's really where we want to be with our pupils' learning. And while we know that that's the target of high retrieval and high storage strength, we also know that pupils will forget. And everyone forgets, it's completely normal. The more time that passes, though, between pupils learning and when they revisit that learning, the greater the learning loss will be. And this is one of the factors which contribute to summer learning loss, where even when the learning has occurred, it can be forgotten over time. And we need to consider that in our current context as well, because even where learning has occurred, if pupils are out of the classroom for 6 months, that's a significant period of time since the initial learning took place. During the academic year, we would normally plan for this forgetting, and actually, forgetting can be beneficial to the learning process as well. Because what's forgotten isn't actually lost. If it was really learned, and this is why it's important that we know the difference between performance and learning, and we make sure that something is really learned. Because if it was really learned in the first place, it's not lost. What we need to do is design and create activities where pupils have to think hard about what they've learned and apply effort to remembering it. And actually that process of going through the effort of remembering something can actually help to build storage strength. So how well and consolidated it is, and it can help them build retrieval strength. So how easily they can recall it later. So we need to be planning for pupils to forget. Integrate retrieval opportunities into medium-term and long-term planning so that we are revisiting content and concepts over and over again. So we should identify points also where new knowledge needs to build on prior learning as well. And because if we're going to build on that prior learning, we want the prior learning to be secure. So we need to plan opportunities to retrieve relevant prior learning, bring it back into working memory, importantly assessing to make sure that knowledge is secure and complete without gaps and misconceptions before we build on it. And it's really important that we remember that practice makes permanent. That practice helps people to consolidate learning and make them able to retrieve it more readily in the future. So once we understand how pupils learn and the complexities around performance and learning and what happens when pupils are forgetting and how we can overcome it, we can try then to overcome learning loss. So remembering that learning loss refers to that specific or general loss of knowledge and skills, or the reversal of academic progress, most commonly due to extended gaps in a pupil's education. The first two that we looked at, where pupils are absent or have interrupted formal education without the alternative provision, they're not in an environment where learning can take place. So we are faced with a challenge where they're not somewhere where learning can actually take place. We're quite limited in what we can do in those scenarios. Our best possible option is try and provide work that bridges that gap and maintains some element of learning. Where we can really start to make the difference is in quality teaching. So ineffective teaching, as we've discussed, leads to learning loss, and that can be a result of many factors. Thinking about what we know about memory and how pupils learn, if new learning is not broken down sufficiently for pupils to process it in working memory, then they're not going to be able to process that new knowledge. So we need to break down learning. If learning's not assessed and it's assumed that because the teacher taught it, it's been learnt, then we may just be looking at performance and pupils haven't actually processed that information or learnt what we had assumed. So we need to embed those assessment opportunities and respond to address any misconceptions or gaps in knowledge. We need to be conscious about trying to retrieve prior knowledge and assess it before we build on it. Because if we build on incomplete knowledge or misconceptions, then we're further embedding those misconceptions. And we need to make sure we don't just assume that performance in the end of lesson assessment means that the pupil has actually learned it, and we need to consciously plan opportunities to retrieve and assess learning at a later date. And finally, that summer learning loss is partly down to the fact that pupils have that extended gap between when they learn something and when it's retrieved again. So by embedding opportunities for retrieval practice when we return to school and when they're going to use that knowledge again, we can build the storage and retrieval strength of learning in long-term memory. So a lot of what we're talking about today can be applied to our current context. The problem that we have, though, is that we've limited research and evidence available. But we can make some comparisons to summer learning loss and build on the evidence around the COVID-19 situation that we have. So if we think about the impact that summer learning loss can have on some groups of pupils in our society, I'll give you a moment to read this statement. So research on summer learning loss shows that during the school holidays, children's learning is not only at risk of stagnating, but actually regressing. And this decline may be more pronounced in children from low-income families, as well as for children with learning disabilities and for whom English is a second language. So some have actually argued that summer learning loss is the main factor behind the attainment gap between the richest and poorest students in our schools, and that this is predominantly driven by inequalities that are experienced over the summer holidays. So evidence for summer learning loss shows that during term time, children across all income groups learn basic skills at a similar rate. However, during the summer months, children from low-income families fall weeks or months behind their middle and high-income peers. So the largest learning loss actually that's been found comes in reading recognition, where children from low-income families will lose approximately a month and a half of learning. Comparably, children from higher income backgrounds will gain over 2 months of learning in reading recognition. Researchers on this found little evidence to suggest that pupils' prior achievement levels, their gender, ethnicity, any of those factors had a consistent influence on summer learning loss. However, they did find that learning loss became even more of an issue as children got older. Now, this is what we know. These are the groups we know that learning loss can impact the most. And recent research from the Sutton Trust into the current context might help to give us some insight into the causes of that gap. So outlined here are the headline findings from the Sutton Trust impact brief on the challenges faced as a result of COVID-19 pandemic. And they began to consider the potential consequences that this gap in education may have on social mobility. So if we take the first point here, evidence from the report does suggest that pupils from private schools are more likely to take part in online lessons while schools are closed, or partially closed is probably the more accurate term here, and have access to online learning platforms where work is shared. Now, that is partly probably down to the fact that many pupils in the state sector do not actually have access to their own personal devices to be able to access that online learning, or they may not have reliable internet access either. If we look at the second point here, we know that the home learning environment is playing an even more crucial role, as that's where most of the learning is now happening. However, parents and carers' level of education is impacting the support that they feel confident in giving their children. With less than half of parents with an A-level or a GCSE level qualification feeling confident in directing their child's learning. And finally, we can see here that some parents have the capacity to spend more money on their children's learning during lockdown. Though current circumstances with employment, levels of spending are very strongly linked to the household income. All of these factors are contributing to a COVID-19 induced learning loss. And in the short term, what we could be facing is a reduction in the level of learning. However, we need to start thinking about what we're doing proactively that can help to challenge this. So remote learning is new territory for everyone. Pupils are not in a classroom environment with teacher support and interaction, and that support and interaction is difficult to replicate. However, a recent review of evidence on remote learning from the Education Endowment Foundation suggests that pupils can learn remotely, and it's regardless of the mode of delivery. Two factors are key to this: teaching quality and supporting pupils to work independently. So if we build on that knowledge that we've developed around how pupils learn, we can apply this to support the implementation of remote learning. So Paul Kushner has some great reading and a video clip around this, and I've included that in the references. But some things to suggest, or some ideas, is making sure we're breaking down new learning and framing it in the larger picture of learning. So how it links to what's gone before, how they will build on it in the future. Referring to prior learning that's relevant and useful here, and where pupils can actually go to find it. Is it in a book? Is it in a textbook they might have? Where can they access that information? Communicating concrete goals and success criteria can help them to set their own goals, regulate their learning, and evaluate their success against that. So monitoring their own learning process. By providing examples and models, our pupils start to see what good looks like and what they are aspiring to achieve, and breaking those models and examples down into steps can help them to replicate that learning in their own context. And then having pupils actually process that material by completing tasks where they're asked to use that knowledge, process it, and apply it to do something. Also crucial in remote learning is assessing that learning. So having very clear assessment opportunities where we also then provide feedback to move the learning forward, and use that information that we gather from assessments and the feedback we provide that will inform our future planning and implementation. And that future planning and implementation might be for further remote learning, or indeed it can be to identify areas of learning that we really need to focus on when we get back into those classrooms. And really importantly, we've been talking about forgetting. So to overcome forgetting, creating those opportunities for pupils to retrieve and review learning with practice and testing remotely. So we should also be considering at this time how we are supporting families to engage with remote learning. And though learning may not be at the same level as we are used to in the classroom, it can still continue. The second point that we may be facing is that where learning is continuing, we may have unequal levels. And this may be as a result of the factors we've already identified. So the capacity that parents have to spend on extra support and resources, or parents' own level of education impacting how comfortable they actually feel supporting their children's learning and guiding and directing it. And we've also highlighted that digital divide as a potential contributing factor to the inequality. So it's really important that when we're thinking about mode of delivery we're using for remote learning, we are thinking about our own pupils and their context, and how suitable is it for all of our pupils to access that information and that learning. And if it's something that's going to disadvantage certain cohorts of our pupils, then we need to either think of an alternative or provide opportunities for learning that are of equal value so that we're not disadvantaging them. And finally, we do need to think about the implications long term. So thinking about this prolonged absence from education, particularly for pupils who might be marginalised or at risk already in our communities, this prolonged absence may make returning to the classroom and school routine really challenging. So we need to think about how we are engaging these pupils, supporting them, and still making them feel part of our community. So I think I've talked for long enough about the kind of cognitive science and the background to it, but it's really important that we hear from our colleagues in primary and secondary context. So I'm going to hand over to you, Rachel, to talk to us about your context and what's happening in Newham.
Oh, okay. I think I've just requested to have control of the screen now. So
Indeed, you should
great.
have it shortly.
Okay, well, hopefully I'm going to be able to build on that a little bit, Paula, just with some sort of ideas and what we're continuing to build. We're definitely not the finished article, and we're continuing to work on this area all the time. But one of the first things that we started to do, oh, sorry, just see whether I can move the screen on. Sorry, everyone. Yeah. Okay, so one of the first things we started to look at when we started thinking about memory loss was we looked at the curriculum design that we have. And sorry, I've just gone back, haven't I, to, sorry, Paula. I seem to have your slide there. Never mind. I'll just talk through curriculum design. It seems to have merged a slide of yours.
I think it's the reformatting.
Ah, okay. Yeah. I'll talk through curriculum design then. Okay, so there was a slide just before this, everyone, which was called curriculum design. So I'm just going to pop it on my other screen here. So one of the things that we first thought of was about the curriculum design and it being a spiral curriculum. And I know that's not new words for us, lots of us use that, but that sort of repeated visiting of key areas, as Paula said, is a really important point, that we don't just cover a topic, cover a skill, but we keep returning to it. And primary colleagues, we know that the national curriculum is vast and broad, and it doesn't break it down as much as we need it to. So we break it down into milestones so that we continue to return to that learning. And then we also looked at the way that we apply our learning in different places. And as some examples of that is the way that we really carefully mapped out, say, the topic of electricity. And we look carefully at where we do it in science, and then where we have the opportunity to apply that learning in DT. Equally so when we're looking at art, the way that we complement it at the same time, another time in computing. Because before we did this, when we did this overview, we realised that sometimes we were having the same areas appear, and then we were having double time on the same area. And actually, by mapping it out carefully and applying it in strategically times to recall that learning was really, really supportive to children recalling their learning. The biggest move that we've made more recently, it builds on the topic that Paula was talking about schema. We've started using concepts in our subject planning, which has been a really big step forward and taken a lot of time with our subject leaders to really consider this area. Our subject leaders have spent time devising the concepts in each of our subjects that they want our school to focus on. And this will continue to be pivotal in the work that we're doing, because we found that when we came to topics, and a really good example of this, and I go back to my own teaching, so I don't talk about anybody else's teaching, but when I used to study the Romans, for example, in a matter of weeks, I would cover topics, and I've written down here, I'd go from entertainment one week, roads to the next, food to the next, soldiers next week, then I'd look at mosaics. And this was all within the topic of history, because I wasn't focused around some key concepts. But what that did was really surface level teaching and surface level learning for our children. So we've really broken it up into these key areas, and history is a really good example for that. So we know that every time we study different units, we might look at change and continuity. We might look at the religious aspect of history. So that's been a really big step forward, and something that it helps children to hook their learning onto. Like Paula was saying about, if we've got some context there that we can hook the new learning onto, really builds that depth. And then finally, with curriculum design, we were able to be really innovative in the way that we mapped our curriculum. Previously, we had a curriculum map that I'll say was forced out of habit. We do 6 weeks geography, 6 weeks history, and that was very common in the primary sector. We've removed that, and we do work in a disadvantaged area. Our children have very low experiences as a generalisation And we felt that they merely touched the surface on topics. So say, for example, the ancient Egyptians, before we knew it, we were only just, children were just grasping it and we were finishing it. So we've actually been, as I said, quite innovative in our thinking, and rather than chopping and changing, we're spending a whole long term on topics to give children a chance to really get to know things. So the curriculum design has been really important for us as part of that memory and reducing the memory loss. And then we come onto the page we're looking at the moment, the lesson planning. And Paula mentioned a little bit before about taking more time on things. We've been really pushing our colleagues to say, we don't have to change the learning outcome every single lesson. We can spend longer on it. And this particularly links into the second point there about Bloom's taxonomy. We've been trying to dispel the myth that we can't have lower order learning outcomes in year 6. Because actually there is a time when children do need to be doing knowledge and understanding in order to get to the later stages. But we were a bit misunderstood about that, but we're now very clear about not changing the learning outcome until the children are ready, until they've grasped it. So it really does link on to one of the points Paula was just making. We do, and we have started doing low stakes quizzing, and I speak a little bit more in the next slide about high challenge, low threat, which is Mary Myatt's work. We've been doing lots of multiple choice questions, lots of returning, so 2 weeks later returning to text, and we're starting to really see the results of that. We do at primary level make reference to learning behaviours, and we've done a lot of work around metacognition as part of learning, and we're quite explicit in that. And an example of that might be saying things like, well done, you showed cooperation, or, you know, that was brilliant, you showed absolute persistence. And by being explicit and spotting it, the aim is that the children will be able to recall that learning behaviour and then be able to use that more. So learning, we call them learning powers. We have associated them with, like lots of people do, characters. And one of the things that I'll talk about later is about writing stories about the learning powers. So children in primary schools really do enjoy using their learning powers. And then the next slide is a set of learning. Let me just see if I can move across. You can tell I'm new at this, can't you? The fear that it won't work. I have to just say this list, this isn't actually part of our federation. It's taken from one of our schools in the borough, but these are all activities that we do use, but this list is taken from another school. But we found particularly that the trump cards has a fantastic way of making sure we know the learning is there. That spotting the fake news, children love that one. And the vlogging and blogging, as I'm sure everyone can imagine, is hugely enthusiastically taken by children. So definitely some ideas here that I can say wholeheartedly do work to make sure children do recall that learning. So then we looked at the learning environment. I've mentioned already about high challenge, low threat, and that Mary Myatt work. And that links into Carol Dweck's work about growth mindset. It really is about that my wonderful mistake. You know, well done, that was a fantastic mistake. What learning do we get from that mistake? Because we, as a school, we know that children need to have problem solving, they need to be challenged, but they definitely need to do it in an environment where they feel safe to do that. I've spoken already about the metacognitive strategies, and just to say that really is about those learning powers, making sure they're up in the room, they make reference to them. We know that children hook onto things when they can see it in the room, so we do direct that explicitly, pointing over to those characters so children can enjoy their learning powers when they're doing them. So just as another point of how we try to overcome loss, interventions is something that we recognise can be supportive. It can become tiresome, and we did recognise that some children were in them for prolonged amounts of time and it was having a negative effect on children. We've recently really started to focus on monitoring the high quality impact using the EEF to give us the ideas on which ones to use. So we're using ones that come highly recommended. And we make sure that it's a 6-week intervention, so it's a really tight baseline, monitoring the impact so that we close that gap, so we return to learning and close that gap. I put at the bottom there about thinking and learning interventions. Again, not to quote too many people, but we use the Shirley Clark growth mindset intervention. She's got some sort of intervention groups. We've used that one, and we also use a separate thinking intervention that we've created ourselves, just to recognise that sometimes children, we can give them specific academic interventions, but actually it's the core learning powers that they're struggling with and they're not able to utilise. So then we move on and we think about, so supporting pupils during lockdown. So supporting pupils during lockdown, things that we've been doing. We've been really, really careful to understand our children and know that if we don't do repetitive activities that children are familiar with, they won't do them. So we've been trying to make sure that we're clear on that. We've provided a range of activities to support different circumstances, providing family activities, which are things like cake making, castle-inspired lunchboxes to try and be creative, but then also trying to do lots of practical activities, things like Lego coordinates. I put down here about spaghetti and marshmallows. None of these will be new to colleagues, but these are the sort of things that we've been trying to do just to keep that learning alive and keep those learning powers going. We have been trying to utilise sort of like the BBC and trying to work alongside those other forms of learning so that there's accessibility for all our children. It's not just reliant on one source. And we obviously have been utilising the blended learning aspects, so trying to do some online learning, but then through regular contact, through telephone calls, making contact to ensure our children have that support. And then equally so, I've already spoken about the areas that we work in. We recognise about the percentages of children able to work, so we've been providing packs and learning resources in different ways in order to support our children. So as we return, we know that our children, lots of our children will not have been learning. We know that lots of children will have very different learning behaviours, and we're doing a lot of CPD about monitoring our children as they return, because we expect some different approaches to learning. So we've encouraged teachers to take up Barry Carpenter's engagement profile on learning. And he speaks about, you know, setting up opportunities for children to be persistent, opportunities for children to be investigative, discovery, sense of anticipation. So we hope that by setting up activities in those ways, we'll really start to get children hooked back into learning. We've also looked at Barry Carpenter's work again on his work on recovery curriculum, looking at the levers and loss. And within a timetable, we are saying that children need an opportunity to talk and space, so lots of P4C, lots of circle time. Reducing the session lengths, children will find it very hard to be on task for sustained length of time, so we're shortening those periods. And increasing play so that children can rebuild those groups. The truth of it is that lots of our children may be looking forward to coming back to school for reasons other than learning. Lots of them be looking forward to coming back to relationships and establishing those friendships. And we know that the anxiety that may bring will disrupt their learning. So we're recognising that and actually supporting them in that. And we are, as Paula said, we're returning to the quality first teaching principles. We also do lots of work around John Hattie and the Sutton Trust, and they clearly state that for disadvantaged children, the difference that quality first teaching makes. So we're doing lots of teacher training around quality first teaching and effective feedback, knowing our children, knowing what they need in order to support those gaps. And then the effective feedback just links into that final point there. We will be adapting our curriculum, we'll be reflecting on our curriculum in order to support those gaps in learning. So a whirlwind tour. Apologies for the slides there, I do apologise, but hopefully there's some ideas there.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And Carly, I think we're over to you.
Hello everyone, thank you very much. So I'm going to divide my part of this webinar into 3 sections. So how we attempt to overcome forgetting before COVID, during COVID, and our plans post COVID, if you like. So the first thing is pre-COVID. So we have consistent routines across the school for how lessons should be delivered. So we have routines for habits and conduct, if you like, that support good behaviour and try really hard to secure interruption-free learning. But we also have routines around the lesson delivery itself, which is essentially based on Rose and Shine's principles of instruction and the literature that has come about from that. So we did a big body of work as a school on what makes an effective do now. And all teachers are expected to adhere to kind of a couple of structures for their lesson. So we don't want to give teachers a 25-point checklist for every lesson, but we do have a few key principles. So the first one is that we have 2 rules for our do now, and the rules are that it has to require no interaction and that it has to recall previous learning. Now, largely that would be yesterday's learning or the lesson before, but of course we encourage that to be last week and last month and to be cumulative in that fashion. That's then followed by direct instruction, and when we have whole school CPD, that focuses on the quality of our modelling and the quality of our explanation, and then lessons then move to a point of guided practice. We in fact have a rule in our school that every lesson needs to have a minimum of 15 minutes of silent independent work. That doesn't mean the teacher can't go around and support pupils, etc., but that is something that we have because we wanted to make sure that in every lesson pupils have that opportunity to independently apply their learning and give the teacher a real sense of what it is that they can and can't do. We also encourage live feedback, so there's also been some work in school around that. We have a knowledge organiser for every single scheme of work in every single subject in our school. We believe it's really important that our pupils and their families are really clear about the minimum knowledge that you need to be successful in any unit of work, and we try to encourage our families to use those with the pupils to test them at home and so on. And the fact that they're all in one place and that every teacher in the department uses the same one means that we can kind of, we're starting to sort of build consistency between peers and teachers and families to make that happen. We get teachers to test pupils on the content of that knowledge organiser in various ways, so through their do nows, other tests, or blanking parts of the knowledge organisers out, all things that I'm sure lots of my colleagues in other schools do, and test them at particular interviews. I'm an English teacher myself, and I'm big on tests. I test pupils all the time. I like to think that they don't always realise they're being tested, but they might say different. So I often show them tests in advance, so they're really clear about what it is that they need to remember, and then I retest them by generating the questions in a different way, testing the same knowledge, but essentially seeking to see that they can be flexible with how they deploy that knowledge. I have had a few classes who've become so comfortable with the knowledge organiser as we've been working through a scheme of work that I've given them the opportunity to make the knowledge organiser different, to make it harder, because they seem to be remembering the content quite fluidly and they really enjoy the ownership of that process. So that's kind of been a big win for us. As a school, we've worked really hard to ensure that our school community really understands how learning and memory works. We do this through meetings, training sessions, lots of assemblies. We teach revision strategies to our pupils explicitly, and then we embed that within the revision that we carry out in lessons and interventions. I think it's something that teaching professions become really aware of in the last 5 years or so. And I think we've worked really hard to make sure that we've taken that learning that's happening outside our building and really brought it into the school to inform our practice. And we believe that our teachers and our pupils actually are really informed in this area. But our biggest piece of work has perhaps been looking, as Rachel said, at looking at your curriculum and how that's structured. Our subject leaders design units so that there is really deep thought behind how things are sequenced, and that they as subject leaders have really worked out with their teams what are the core concepts, the core knowledge that you need in order to be able to progress on to the next unit the next year and essentially be successful at the end of your time with us. And we sensibly use the principles, I think, of kind of interleaving, spacing and retrieval practice along the way. You know, we really make sure that people don't do that randomly. There is thought behind how people do that. So essentially, I guess our kind of teaching learning philosophy, much of it is that we plan to interrupt forgetting, and we work really hard to help our pupils to strengthen their ability to store things in their memory. We're very comfortable with the idea that they forget, and in fact I would argue that our work is to make sure that they don't forget that information. That's something we preempt, I think. So during COVID, which kind of feels like it was a long way away now, but it also feels very immediate. So, I mean, the first thing that we did as a school was work really hard to ensure that all of our pupils had a device and had internet access, and actually some members of staff. And that was a huge piece of work that our head teacher really championed, reaching out to various organisations to make sure that happened. We had people delivering laptops to students' homes and things like that. So that's obviously the first thing. If they're learning remotely, that's really important. And there were a couple of instances where we photocopied, you know, the booklets, for example, that we use, and we sent them home to pupils until we could get them online. We then decided that actually lockdown came about pretty quickly, and so the first thing that we did, we kept it really simple. We didn't want to panic staff or panic pupils, because obviously people have got their own things to be concerned about. So we said we're going to devise a new timetable, because following a 6-period day 5 days a week and planning for that is actually quite tough. So we reduced the timetable and shared that with all staff and all our pupils and their families, and then decided that actually the best thing to do was to just say, look, this is the platform you use, this is when you set the work, this is the time it needs to be up. And we did that for 2 weeks. Then it was the Easter holidays, and that gave us as a leadership group and a teaching and learning team a lot more time to kind of think about, well, where do we go from here? So what we decided was actually that the structure we have for learning in our classrooms works really well. It's really well informed, because it's evidenced by the kind of literature and research that's out there. And we wanted to try and emulate as much of that in the remote learning systems as possible. So what we asked our teachers to do was to plan the lessons for that week, making sure that there was a recap activity, that there was a video of some really high quality teacher talk, so explanation, modelling, and then there was an independent task set for the pupils. So sticking, you know, to our principles of what should happen in the classroom, and that we also asked them to set a weekly quiz in every subject that would test the knowledge that they had delivered in that lesson. And we said to them, 10 questions is absolutely fine. You know, this doesn't need to be something that's going to take hours and hours. And our staff became upskilled really quickly actually in using things like Loom and Show My Homework quizzes and Microsoft Forms to be able to collate that information in a way that wasn't too onerous once they got the hang of it. The other thing we really thought about was kind of the learning loss of handwriting. Maybe as an English teacher I feel kind of more sort of obsessive with that, but pupils working online all the time is not something that we necessarily wanted to encourage, never mind the kind of logistical things. You know, there's lots of panic about pupils not being on devices all the time. And then here we are telling them to be on their devices for 6 hours a day. So we thought about that, and we thought about the handwriting and the fact that pupils are going to have to complete assessments upon return, and obviously terminal external exams with handwriting. So what we asked teachers to do was to try, where possible, to set the independent task as something that could be completed offline, something that needed to be written by hand and then could be photographed and sent to a teacher, for example. And that seemed to work really well. And in fact, we also sent out questionnaires at various intervals to pupils, teachers and parents. And there were lots and lots of parents who actually said that they thought that that was a really beneficial thing and they wanted more offline work to be set. So again, I think we tried to really emulate what happened in the classroom, but we were also really aware of not just forgetting content, but not forgetting the skill of handwriting either. And then also initially we said consolidation in terms of the content for 7, 8 and 9, not repeating work they'd already done before, but using it in a different way. And we asked subject leaders to think about what's the core knowledge they'll need moving forward. How can you turn that into resources they can use right now? But then as lockdown was extended, we said that actually releasing new material, moving on to different schemes of work was probably really important for pupil engagement and motivation. So people have done that, but they have adjusted their curriculum so that perhaps the slightly more challenging stuff is left to a later point in the year. And finally, after COVID-19, which is kind of, I suppose, where we are now, is we wanted our pupils and our staff to return to school in as normal as possible, essentially. So we are still sticking to the classroom routines and the lesson structures that we had before. We're going to carry out tests in September on particular groups of pupils, not in an arduous, stressful way, because I think that's really important. And actually, we kind of feel that, you know, huge suites of mock exams are also not necessarily the best way to assess where pupils are at. So we have our subject leaders and their teams devising content-based assessments, so they can kind of reduce the noise in the assessment and really get to the core of what it is that these pupils remember, and give them a much more kind of sharper perspective, I suppose. We want to do much more work with our pupils going forward on using online resources. You know, some of our subject leaders have been directing pupils to things like Oak Academy, and Rachel, you mentioned the BBC, and I think those things are there and they'll be there forever, I hope, and I want to encourage people to do that and to build on their self-quizzing. I think as a school we've got a lot of work to do on metacognition and self-regulation, and I really want our pupils to be better at that. We also want to build on the revision that we've been teaching them. As I said, we've made them really aware of kind of cognitive science, how we learn and how we remember, and we've talked to them about the perils of highlighting something and how that feels as if you're remembering and you're aware, but actually that doesn't help you to retain that information. They all know that, they all gasp, they love the being told, you think you're doing this but you're not, and we've encouraged them to make flashcards, but actually we probably need to do some work with them on what makes a good flashcard. For example, how can you make that flashcard even better, how might you use them? We will probably going forward use some tutoring and some careful mentoring of the pupils who are very behind, but we need to think very carefully about how we're going to deploy that, because I agree with Rachel that we need to be careful that that doesn't become something that pupils resent. We need to make sure that it's not something we try too much to kind of quantify with data. Like, that's a big piece of work that needs to be really well thought through. We want, I think, in terms of CPD to build on how our teachers have used quizzing, because actually it's low work for them if you do it online and it collates the resources but can give you really immediate and helpful information. But I think one of the things we've also been thinking about in terms of memory is that we do lots and lots of work to kind of quiz, test, reuse information, but we're thinking that actually there's some work to be done around teacher explanation. So as well as it being really clear, teacher having excellent subject knowledge, really have thought through the questions they want to ask, you know, using bullet points, keywords, actually there's probably some things to do around using metaphor, using storytelling, so that the teacher explanation in the moment is actually memorable in some way. So teachers will say, oh yeah, it's like Miss Moran said, it was kind of like a flower or something, you know, that kind of thing I think will really help pupils. And I just feel like actually teachers are really great at plugging gaps. Teachers are really great at working out very quickly that pupil hasn't remembered this. I don't think that pupil did the homework, so they don't seem to know X at all, and really kind of filling that void. But I think what's really important actually upon returning to school is that we don't fall into the trap of thinking that pupil doesn't know this, so we're going to do this activity or have this lesson and then that gap is filled. We need to continue to retest that information as we would from a clean slate of a curriculum, because otherwise things get forgotten in exactly the same way. That's it from me.
Thank you so much, both Carly and Rachel, for sharing your experiences. We, I think, have run out of time for questions. However, I know we did have one question in the chat regarding some reading that I think you mentioned, Rachel, around growth mindset. So I'm going to see if we can read that, or sorry, if we can share it after the event in some of the follow-up resources, if you wouldn't mind. I'll get that reference from you, and then we can share it and it'll be available. But sorry that we don't have time for questions. However, if you want to get in contact, I think we've shared our Twitter details, and just even if you want to send a message and we can pass it on to the relevant individual. But that's all that we have got time for today. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll be sharing, like I said, some of that follow-up reading on the Ambition Institute website and on the Twitter account. So check it out if you want to delve further into anything we've talked about, and how we can try to overcome learning loss. So if this session has sparked your interest, and you may want to find out more about professional development programs within Ambition. So like I said at the start, we run them for teachers and school leaders at every stage of their career. So you can, the website details are here if you want to have a look at any programs and find one that might be right for you. And as I said at the beginning, this is our final webinar in the summer series. If you want to catch up on any of the previous sessions, you can find them on the website and they're available to watch on demand. And I've been suggesting to loads of people that maybe professional development for the the new academic year, there's lots of things now out there that are on YouTube and on websites that you might want to store and keep and actually share among your teams as we enter into the new academic year, and kind of get them into some of the things that you might have been learning about and looking into as well. So thanks again everyone for joining us, and thanks again Carly and Rachel, but have a great evening everyone.